what I think has been an outstanding inaugural Cambridge Schools Open. Maybe a round of applause for all participants at the grand finals. So without further ado, let's announce who's in the grand final and then the topic, and then we'll get going. So in our grand final at OG, we have Riverview 1. At OO, we have Trinity 1. At CG, we have Imble 1. And at CO, we have Sydney Girls 2. Our adjudication panel at the back, we have Connor, Annika, Archie, David and Ellie. And the motion for today, so we have an info slide. The lesser of two evils narrative states that when faced with a choice between two imperfect, viable political candidates, voters in democracies have an obligation to vote for the preferable of the two, rather than abstain or vote for a non-viable third option. The motion for the grand final is this House supports the lesser of two evils narrative. Without further ado, I'm going to record and we'll get going. I welcome the debaters to begin.
Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Speaker, I think it's quite silly to suggest that panel, come November, I think it's quite silly to suggest that Americans come November should withhold their vote or simply vote for a smaller party candidate as opposed to voting for Joe Biden in respect of he is the lesser of two evils against Donald Trump. I think it's quite silly to suggest that they should stay at home and be complicit in the victor of a more evil candidate when they are unable to effectuate change by withholding their vote. A couple of things I'm going to do in this speech. First of all, on a point of setup. Second of all, on the effects of not voting or voting for a smaller party. And third of all, on the benefits that you can only unlock through voting for the lesser of two evils. First of all, on a point of setup, I think the counterfactual in this debate is quite intuitive. That is just to say that the narrative probably would have emerged that you ought vote for the candidate who you prefer the most, that being or that you ought vote for neither of the two evils. That looks like you do not vote at all, or you vote for a small party. I think the next couple of things to do on setup is what does the world actually look like? I think it's important to note that most of the world does not vote in the way that Australia does. Australia votes using a preferential voting system. Most of the world does not operate like this. They operate through first past the post balloting, which looks like whoever gets the most votes wins. That means that voting for smaller parties is much less effective in the rest of the world as it is in Australia. As I think that this is a global debate, this puts like a much more onus on side opposition to prove why this is a really good tactic worldwide. I think the second thing is to do is that normally in these races, evils probably aren't extremely evil people. The candidates that are chosen are probably likely to be quite good. Why is this the case? First of all, the party does just want to get voted in. They're probably going to choose candidates for these seats or presidential candidates that are most likely to get them in, that are most representative of the population. Second of all, they want to win, these people have to win the support of the party in order to be voted to be the candidate for this place. Third of all, they are picked specifically to represent the country or represent the region that they're running in. And I think fourth of all, never mind, I can't read my writing. Okay, I'll take a point if you have one. In closing.
Yeah. In the long term, would you rather the emergence of good politicians or not horrible politicians?
Well, I think that we just challenge that in the long term you are able to effectuate change, but I think that also the effects in the short term of not voting or not voting for these greater of two evils are just a lot worse than the benefits you might be able to see in the long term. On to my first piece of substantive, which is effectively the effects of not voting or voting for smaller parties. Firstly, on a point of characterization, I think that there are lots of small, viable parties that exist, particularly on the left of politics. Why do we think that this is probably the case? We think that the left moves and changes policies at a much higher rate, simply because they are progressive. They do just have like a much wider field of ideals. Secondly, they're brought into progress. Second of all, I think that there is a more specific diversity diversity on the left rather than conservatives who rally behind very specific ideals such as like free speech and such as like the Second Amendment in America. We think there are a much more broad set of ideals on the left. I think that third of all, the issues with on the left are about identity, and I think people on the left are specifically opposed to voting for people who don't necessarily they identify with or reject people who are of their identity. So I think it's pretty clear that there are likely to be larger amounts of small parties on the left as opposed to on the right. This is just to say that that's probably true. I think the effects of this are quite intuitive. When it comes time for people to go to the voting booths and people don't have this narrative in their head, particularly on the left, they're probably going to vote for like a small party candidate or not vote at all. And I think that this probably means that large party candidates on the left are going to be receiving far less votes, whereas large party candidates on the right are going to achieve much larger amounts of votes. So why is this particularly bad? I think first of all, simply the intuitive reason this is unrepresentative of the broad population. I think that even if a majority of the people exist on one side of the political spectrum, having candidates consistently get in on the opposite side of the political spectrum is quite a bad thing. I think second of all is that like this house probably just agrees that the right is bad. I will not elaborate on this. Second of all, I think that additionally under the government, I think that the second part to this argument is a principled claim. I think that this is just quite intuitive, is that it wastes your right to vote, your principled obligation to vote. Why does this exist? First of all, the government decides on your interests and the interests of the people around you. Second of all, the government ought represent the population the best. And through your withholding of voting or giving your vote to a small party that is not able to get in, your vote effectively goes to waste, and that means that the person who best represents the majority of the population probably doesn't get in. So effectively, the result of this argument is that it is just principally bad that you are giving up effectively your right to vote for the candidate who you like most. Yet before I get on to my next point, I'll take a point from closing if you have one.
Do you agree that this narrative gives politicians impunity to run bad policies?
No, because we still think that you want to run better policies than your opposition, but we also do just think that you probably are more in... okay. If I've missed something, my partner will deal with it. On to my second point, which is effectively, what are the benefits of voting? So I think the first thing to note is that these large political parties probably are just quite representative of the broad population, as like unlike probably side opposition would like you to believe. Why is this the case? Probably just because, first of all, they want to get a bigger voter base, so they have to be quite more moderate in order to get this, as opposed to like very small political parties who just want to spec in to one very small set of voters. This looks like the Liberal Party being probably more moderate than like Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party or Clive Palmer's Thingo Party. I think this probably means that either of the two evils are probably going to be quite good, and they're probably going to represent at least about half of the population. I think that additionally, they probably get broader criticism from the public simply because they are bigger parties. That means that they probably are going to want to alter their policies in order to pander to the public a lot more. Secondly, on the point of like benefits of voting, I think it is quite intuitive to claim that there are other ways of making change if and only if you give your vote to these quite big parties. I think that this is quite intuitive. Parties are willing to take criticism and feedback from their population simply because they want to win their votes, but they are more likely to take the criticism and criticism of the people who already vote for them. Simply, they are their voting base, and if the parties feel that they might be leaving them, then they're probably going to be willing to make more change if they believe that their current voting base is going to leave them. How does this actually look like? This looks like, oh, I voted Labour at the last election, I'm going to phone my local candidate, I'm going to mail into my local candidate, and I'm going to ask about change, as opposed to, and saying that I'm a Labour voter, but as opposed to me saying, oh, I voted Anthony Albanese at the last election, here's what I voted for Anthony Green at the last election, here's what I would like you to do, Anthony Albanese. I ran out of time, I wasn't looking at my timer. Speaker, you should vote opening government.
Let me just. Oh. Sorry. Okay. How do I? I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Speaker, the opposition, the government side of the House today, creates a world in which people are not able to clearly communicate their desire for better politicians. It creates a world in which politicians believe that people are happy with the status quo, and the opposition side of the House today, where this narrative, where we oppose this narrative, is able to get better politicians overall, and is able to change the style in which politicians represent themselves to the people, which has positive outcomes. But before I begin my substantive, a few pieces of general rebuttal. Okay, the opposition has talked about how, firstly, people have this principal obligation to vote. What we see is that actually we believe that people don't have this principal obligation to vote, and we believe this for a few reasons. Firstly, we think people have the fundamental obligation to freely express themselves in the way in which they vote. So if this means not voting for them, we think that this is a valid way of kind of not voting, but still voting like your clear intentions, as I will be explaining, and so therefore we don't think that people have this principal obligation to vote for different parties. And now onto my speech. Firstly, a few points of setup. The narrative that we see proposed by the, this narrative is extremely damaging as it is perpetuated the most by people who this narrative benefit. That is to say that this narrative does not exist due to some altruistic factor in society. This narrative exists because it is perpetuated by people who may be in one of these parties that are considered evil. And so what this means is that these parties have less of a burden to prove that they are genuinely good, and instead can get away with proving that they are the lesser evil. And that is why we think that essentially this narrative is perpetuated for an extremely negative reason. Now let's characterize, what do we see when there are situations where it is a lesser of two evils situation? That is to say that there are two parties, both of which are not considered good by the general public or specific people. What we see is that the desired outcome in this general situation is to have better future politicians, right? We know that the current politician is likely to be harmful. However, as government has characterized, they are likely to be quite good, as they are elected by their party and are meant to be the most viable candidate. Therefore, we see that in the short term, they're not likely to cause a massive end to the country, as government has characterized them as quite good, and so therefore the focus should be on getting long-term outcomes. So how does our side of the House get long-term outcomes? So on my first piece of substantive is how we get better politicians overall. So the first mechanism through which we do this is we allow people who believe that it is a better of two evils situation to send a clearer message. Note that under the status quo, when people are forced to vote, this allows political parties to kind of falsely characterize that people are happy with them, that people are happy, and it gives them legitimacy to govern. Note that in a situation where people might not vote, where this narrative does not basically exist, we see, not right now, where this narrative does not exist, we see that people are more likely to send a clearer message that they are not happy with the political status quo, send a clearer message to the general public and also to politicians that they need better politicians overall. And note that we see many examples in in the world where not voting, we're abstaining to vote. Yes.
Social media exists, political polls exist. How is my right to express which political candidate I want diminished?
Well, what we see is that your right is diminished because these political parties are able to spin the fact that people voted for them more. They can say, look, a majority of the population or a large amount of the population voted for us, therefore we have legitimacy to govern, therefore we are a good party. However, under our side of the House, where we think that this, what we see is that this sends a clearer message. For example, when we see situations such as Venezuela, where there are illegitimate democracies, where people are able to say, no, we're not going to vote for this bad person, or we're not going to vote and not have our vote counted. We are able to we're abstaining from this vote, and we've seen in this situation that people are able to get better solutions, such as in Venezuela, like better leaders being elected. And we think that this is a very crucial part, which the government side of the House has failed to mention. In illegitimate democracies, or democracies that may be struggling, it is vital that people feel like they can abstain, because this narrative makes people feel like they have to vote for essentially what is the lesser evil, and in many cases this may be voting in a way which means that their vote is not counted, and so therefore we think in illegitimate democracies, our side of the House is able to win, because we are able to show how this obligation to make kind of the lesser of two evils decision is negative. Now, secondly, we see what the second mechanism through which we get better politicians is that when people have to vote for the lesser of two evils, this does not properly unite people who don't like the two politicians overall. And so why do we see that this is the case? What we see is that when people have to vote, different people likely have different preferences of who they think is like the best option for the country. Therefore, they're likely to be more divided overall. Not right now. And therefore, what we see is that these people are likely to kind of divide themselves and get into these political parties. As the opposition themselves has like said, these people will be addressing themselves as, oh, I voted for Labour, instead of, oh, I was not happy with the situation, which we think when people acknowledge that they're not happy with the situation and are able to form a group and kind of like rally around the idea that they were not happy with the situation, we think that this overall was a way in which people were able to get politicians. I'll take a PI from closing for this one. 3, 2, 1. Okay, now moving on to my speech. How in the long run does having this kind of lesser of two evils mentality create politicians who are overall more, how does this change the state of politics? What we see is that if this lesser of two evils narrative is present, this kind of shifts the burden of political parties. It shifts it away from how do we make the country better to how are we better than our opposition. And we think that what this really causes is this kind of like attack dog politics. We're always trying to prove that you're just better than the other major party. You're not trying to prove how you truly make the country better. And why is this so detrimental? Well, what we see is that when these parties are focused on attack dog politics, they're not focused on truly proving that they are better in the long run. They're not focused as much. It's not so much a debate of policies, but more a debate of like who is the better candidate in like often more personal ways. What we see is that there can often be personal attacks brought up to prove why you're like the lesser of two evils. Whereas under our side of the house, where we don't necessarily have this narrative, we are able to create a world in which political parties have the burden to show that they are truly making the country better. And we think that this results in more trust from people of the political system, because they see politicians less of these attack dogs and more of people who genuinely want to make the country better. And B, we see better politicians overall who are more focused on getting substantial policy outcomes rather than simply trying to beat their opponents. And this is why I'm proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for their speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to close the case for opening government.
I have to speak into this, don't I? That's right. In today's debate, I'm going to do 3 things. First of all, prove why the opposition's mechanisms for creating political change absolutely fail. 2, add another piece of substantive to this debate. And then 3, with our first big speech, proving why we win this debate. So first of all, onto protests and why either their thing is completely symmetric or it actually creates worse things. So a couple of things. So first of all, what are the ways that people can protest in their worlds and in our worlds? First of all, we believe that the best way to create political change and actually critique people is through protests. Why? Through other mechanisms. Why? They're a lot more specific, first of all. Why is this so deeply important? Because the opposition can in no way actually critique through their systems, actually critique anything that a government system does, right? They can do that in absolutely no detail to anything. So how do the governments know what's happening, right? Absolutely no way. Why are protests, stuff on social media, stuff that people actually articulate with their words, more beneficial? They can critique specific government policies. That's what governments are likely to change. Governments just won't change who they are entirely. They need specific stuff, right? So that's why we are most definitely going to be able to do this too. Protests, we also believe are like highly effective. They represent a large groups of people and most likely going to work. Two, we already believe that there are so many polls that governments put out to assess how people actually believe, right? So we believe that voting isn't the only way, and most definitely not even like the most important for people, because they can see it in this way. Also, we'd just like to note, because we exist in a world where this narrative is like a thing, we believe that politicians know that people will vote even if they don't necessarily like it. We believe politicians are aware of this, and this means we believe they're going to be more cautious of this, because they know that people can be dissatisfied with them. So it means they're also going to be aware of this. Finally, a couple of things. Even if you vote for a party, you can still fight for them inside that party. We believe there's there is large fracturing within parties, like Labour left and Labour right, and we believe there's large groups of people that, even though they vote for Labour, have varying different views on Labour and are very aware of that. Okay. And then finally, social media and anything else. Two, I'd just like to point out what is most likely to happen in the opposition's world. Abstinence or voting for third parties. And I think this is important because I think it proves more. We, on this case, believe it's abstinence, right? Why? Because if someone views that all these main parties are horrible, they normally have a large distrust for the government, they have a large distrust for their voting system, and they generally view voting not as good, right? They eventually view this whole system as horrible, and they're more likely to object to it. They think probably think it's unreasonable. They think maybe the governments have been doing bad messaging, have been doing something horrible, probably bad campaigning or lies, or just even that the votes are rigged. And you see this internationally. Two, we also believe abstaining is just easier. If you really know that you're not going to do anything, you don't really care. It's likely that you're not going to have to get a bill to leave work, which happens in so many countries. You're likely to, generally, a lot of people are low SES, they can't afford to take time off work. They don't want to just lose a day. We believe this is something significant. It's a large effort. So they'd have to prove something else. So why is this specifically important for this debate? Because if you're abstaining, there's absolutely no way that the oppositional parties can tell that something is wrong. We believe that, look in America, millions and millions of people abstain and they're not doing anything about it. We believe this can also be confused with things like donkey voting and stuff like this. So we believe at the point that people are abstaining instead of voting for third parties, then there's absolutely nothing that the opposition is doing. And so we believe literally more than half of Americans don't vote, right? So and that makes no change. People don't think that's important. People just think that's the cultural system. They really don't think this is something specifically horrible with this. So we believe for those reasons, the opposition's case completely fails, and they have no mechanisms for creating political change, especially not in the long run. So onto my piece of substantive, which is we create long-term sustainable change. So this is an addition to our first biggest speech. So the most and effective way to get meaningful, safe, and political change is through the policy and government. I think we all accept this. This is the best way to get real change. So that is to say that you require the government to some degree to be in power or to have mechanisms to make change. Why is this important? Because laws, policies, anything like that is the most important thing to actually meaningfully enforcing and making change, right? So it is vital in this debate that we have the government on our side. Agreed? So how do we achieve this? Voting, so we believe that if people vote for parties that are most likely to represent them, that are closest to what they would do, then it's likely to fit best in what people think. We'd just like to note that you are never voting for a party that is exactly what you represent, right? You are always going to have to give up something, and something is never going to represent exactly what you want, okay? We just believe that there's probably no difference between how people normally vote and this specific abstract thing. This is just to a large extent. So we believe that it's most definitely acceptable to do that, but also it just means that this is generally how voting works in general. You vote for the person that most represents you. So you're going to get the most likely thing for you. Why is this specifically effective for making change? So we believe movements occur together, right? So they believe there's a large influx of movements, but certain governments promote and don't promote these movements. They speed them up and they slow them down. So if you have a large very leftist movement, but doesn't quite garnish all support. Let's look at what happens in both sides. On our side, you vote for the kind of left, pseudo-left government, right? What does that do? It means they're probably more accepting to listen to more radical left ideas than a super right government would be, which means they're more likely to air these, people are more likely to see these, people are more likely to engage with these ideas. It means that, yeah.
In the absence of this narrative, do you think that alternative parties would be more successful?
No, I think we've already proved that abstaining would be most likely, so people wouldn't do this. We also believe that because most countries don't exist in Australia, these parties don't really get in or don't have any sway. So we believe that this probably wouldn't be successful. Also, we believe they're less important in the debate because they don't have as much power and nothing nearly as big. Okay, so continuing these things. So one, they're more likely to support these people. Two, they're also more likely to spread information and awareness around what they think, and that exists on a spectrum. So some of the stuff is probably going to be more left than what your right party would do, right? Also, we believe that they're probably likely to spread policies that surround them. They're probably more likely to agree with these people. They're probably more likely to accept them. There's probably going to be some people more left in their party that can actually push for change than in another party. In either side, I'm just saying left. So we see that this is actually likely to push the movement, right, a bit. What is the opposition case? The opposition's case is these people abstain, right, and nothing happens. Why is this horrible? Because this means you get the right party in. What does the right party do? They polarize the system. They mean that these people don't get informed. These people can't have their voices. No one is allowing these people to speak. No one is engaging with them.
Then they're probably criminalizing them. They're probably suppressing them, marginalizing, less likely to engage with them, doing a lot of bad stuff. Also, so for these reasons, we believe that eventually, after you do this through a long duration, you're most likely to get a large number of benefits, and it's likely to create long-lasting change. So for this, and the reasons our first speaker stated, we believe that it's absolutely justified to create this. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech and welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close the opening part of this debate.
Can you do that?
Starting 3, 2, 1. Speaker, I think what opposition cannot ignore in this debate is that their real burden is to defend why in all cases people had an obligation to be voting for the lesser of two evils. Because sure, in instances where it might have legitimate reasons for people to do this, we said that they can still do it under our side of the house where this obligation didn't exist simply because people are rational actors. They are able to make decisions in this debate, right? We say that this debate didn't occur in these really obvious instances. We thought that this occurred in more occurred in instances where people actually genuinely thought that this government really sucked and would be really horrible, right? Okay, so 2 points of rebuttal before I get into the 3 points of substantive. Firstly, why we think that no one can actually be able to send this message, right? So that was basically opposition's claim, right? We're under our side of the house. I think what we say is that when you don't vote for any party, this sends out a message in itself that this horrible, the political system was just simply horrible, right? And I gave you America as an example here, but we said that the reason that there hasn't been any change in America is because of how polarized the system is, where there's people supporting both the ultra conservative and the ultra progressives in the system, right? So we just say that the reason that no change has occurred in countries such as America, they wanted to push as an example, is because of the heavy polarization in this debate, right? Okay, secondly, they tell you something about long-term sustainable change happens with this. I think firstly, right, it's just to say what happens if both parties don't want to do this, right? We tell you that people still had an obligation to vote under their side of the house. Know that this didn't exist under our side of the house. That's where we were actually able to take the majority of the debate, right? Firstly, why we think that this should be an obligation, and then secondly on why we thought that in case of illegitimate democracies, and then thirdly of just a way up between short-term versus long-term, right? Okay, so firstly on why this shouldn't be an obligation. I think there are two parts of this. Firstly, we told you at first, this was simply a principle, right? People people had a choice to express themselves in whatever they want, even if this meant voting in the wrong way, or for example not voting at all, right? We told you that this was a fundamental right of any human being in a democracy, right? We just told you that was just the reason democracies existed, right? And why we didn't have a technocracy, which could make best decisions for people, right? But I feel secondly, where in cases where this was genuinely good for people to vote for a certain government, for example, in the cases of for example Liberal versus Labour, if people did find it genuinely persuasive that Labour was the lesser of two evils, and it would be most effective that they were able to vote for the Labour Party, we tell you that what we saw last election was that a lot of people did vote for them, right? And we just tell you, yeah, okay, I'll take it.
Okay, so if you were going to get rid of the lesser of two evils narrative, what is going to encourage these voters to actually consider voting and to make the decision not to donkey vote or, for example, abstain from voting just for the sake?
Well, I just think it's the fact that voters want change, right? Like fundamentally people, when they're in a sucky democracy, they just want change to occur, right? So we tell you that's the first mechanism. I just feel like secondly, like opposition gave you no reason at all for like why this narrative needed to exist for people to like bother to like actually like go vote and stuff. Like we just told you that even though this narrative exists, it wasn't like even perfect, right? Okay, so that was my point, right? I feel like what this means is that like when it comes to like the Labour Liberal example, was that in the cases where like it was genuinely good for like a person to vote for another like party, we just simply tell you that this like means that like most people would actually vote for this party would be able to come to power, right? So we just tell you that we didn't need this obligation to occur. We were able to use like own like natural change for this to occur, right? Okay, so now what does this mean? I think what this means is that like a lot of the times like it was like these imperfect democracies when both parties would push this principle simply so like they would be seen legitimate by both parties. Secondly, we told you they often had a lot of principle or like a lot of capital to be able to propagate this, and we just told you this was a reason in itself why these parties would just simply not change at all, right? So that's why we told you that we didn't need this obligation. Secondly, there was like a principal reason for like why this obligation shouldn't exist. Okay, so now secondly on illegitimate democracies, right? I think what we proved in that first point was that most of the times in like heavily legitimate democracies, we saw that people would just vote for like the best party, or for example like the parties that they thought were the best, right? So I think more importantly, what happens in these illegitimate democracies, right? I think firstly is to say minorities often just have like no one to look up to, right? We told you that a lot of like these illegitimate democracies, like these minorities simply would just have to vote for like under like the obligation. These minorities just simply just have to vote for like one of the really like bad parties. We tell you that often, like for example, like the scale of like how bad it is, which is like not much different, right? So we just tell you that minorities were especially harmed by this. We tell you that in these illegitimate democracies, there was often a lot of crackdown on social media. There was a lot of crackdown on protests, which means that these mechanisms necessarily didn't work in this debate, right? Firstly, why do we think that these illegitimate democracies are so important in this debate? I think first it's just a way of like we just thought that like in these democracies this was the most particularly like reasons we should be caring about this, because like these were like the worst cases. These were the cases where we would actually be able to prove the best impacts. Secondly, it's just to say that like substantively, like we just proved to you why we thought that like in the majority of cases this would be like the illegitimate democracies that were actually going to be like the ones that we actually cared about in like this debate, right? Okay, so now before I get into my next point opening, yeah.
On the principle, if it's generally assumed that people have a principal obligation to engage in society, is it not your burden to prove why they should be able to abstain from engaging in society?
Well, I just think that people can just like not engage in society. Like we just tell you that like if you don't want to work, you just don't have to work. You don't have to like necessarily be like it's like nothing's like saying that you have to be like ultra nationalistic or you have to support your country. But I feel like secondly, it's like the burden we proved was that like democracy in itself is like you are able to express yourself in any way you want or like any legitimate way that didn't really harm society that much. So we just tell you that, well, yeah, like people have the right to like just not vote or vote for like a bad party, right? We tell you that was just like a principle. Okay, so now on to like the short term versus the long term. I think what do you get on the short term? I think what you get on the short term is actually minimized because most of the times it looks like a really bad candidate. We tell you that this often occurred in these illegitimate democracies, which had a lot of weight in this debate and a lot of impact in this debate, right? We tell you that in these cases it was like a relatively good candidate, we just tell you that this relatively good candidate didn't necessarily have to like look like a really good one, right? So like we tell you that opposition may be able to get the short-term benefits of a slightly better condition, but we tell you on the long term, these parties still trying to propagate this. We tell you that it was unlikely that people would be able to protest because protests took a lot more capital than, for example, just like deciding to like not rock up like to like the voting booth, right? So we tell you that was the first thing. But what do you actually get on the long term? I think firstly on like these minority parties, I think what you saw in the last federal election in Australia was that like when more people vote for the Till independence, this was what actually brought like the Liberal Party down, right? So we tell you that in the second cases, like for example, there may not be like these like minority parties, then we just simply tell you that, well, okay, sure, people won't vote for these minority parties, they're more likely to express themselves when they don't vote, right? So we tell you that when they don't vote, this actually delegitimizes the result of the election. This actually allows protests to happen more easily because these parties can no longer say, well, we actually got a majority in this election. We tell you that what happens now is that people can say, no, you didn't get a majority in this election because you were good. You got a majority in this election simply because you were they just quit like delegitimize these parties and make them seem like not so legitimate, right? So that was like the first impact of like the short term versus the long term. What are the impacts of this? I think the impacts of this is that even in the worst cases, we still tell you we get a massive benefit because people could express themselves better. Protests worked more efficiently on the outside of the house, but we were also able to prove to you why in the majority of cases we aren't actually going to be talking about like these really obvious cases of like, for example, voting for the Labour Party when you care about the environment and not the Liberal Party. So proud to oppose.
the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, welcome the Member of Government to begin the closing remarks of this debate. Please.
Alright, give me a few seconds to sort out my podcast. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What the opposition is essentially suggesting is forcing unaware, uncaring population, perfect for harmful politicians to essentially fight to run over, to essentially somehow throw away the chance of actually having a voice in these democracies. We believe what the counterfactual is essentially really harmful for is the most volatile stakeholder in this debate, which is essentially new or fading democracies, where essentially the strong democratic value in people has not yet been instilled or has already begun to fade. Thus, we believe in these places what we need is a strong voter voice, not those who simply throw away their chance by voting for parties who will never be viable in parliament anyways. Alright, so first of all, I'd like to open with some rebuttal to O's case. They've mainly essentially stated how their side will be the side who better enable citizens to achieve political change and essentially gain what they want. First of all, we believe that the important note to consider under this topic is that in the counterfactual, no other party, no third option is actually viable. In fact, it's actually stated in the info slide that the third party is unviable. Thus, what does this mean? Essentially encouraging them to vote for parties like this means essentially throwing their chances, because this third party in the first place has no feasible way to overcome power and thus achieve the change that they're truly aiming for. Thus, we believe the best way is to capitalize on existing competition between the two main candidates and essentially force them to present themselves as better for the country. Alright. Furthermore, we believe that we're actually sending a very clear message to politicians when they are being inadequate for citizens. Because obviously, there's not only going to be one political candidate. In fact, this motion specifically applies to when they have two strong, viable political candidates. Thus, we believe there is one word: competition. We believe there is no clearer message that you're inadequate for the country when you lose the election to your competitor. Thus, we believe we are actually sending the clearer message by telling politicians that they need to improve themselves. Alright, therefore we believe since our side actually has clearer involvement and more productive discussion, which I'll later expound on in my extension, we actually able to send a clearer political message and inspire more change for the long term. Alright, so now essentially onto my extension. First of all, we believe we actually inspire better electoral promises and better political changes from these candidates themselves. Alright, how will citizens be affected by constantly being told that, oh, you should choose the lesser of two evils? We believe this narrative essentially emphasizes their responsibility to choose essentially the lesser of the two evils. What does this mean? This means that instead of abstaining, it tells them to actually be involved in this political landscape. It tells them to care, because it is your responsibility as a citizen to therefore choose the lesser of two evils instead of either defaulting to your favorite party or running away from the situation because you actually have no idea what to do. We believe what will result from this by telling citizens, by emphasizing to citizens that you should be involved in this political process. It is encouraging them to know more about the political environment. It is leading to more productive discussions between people because they're more interested in essentially recognizing which politician would truly be the lesser of two evils for them. I'll take that later. It also results in essentially citizens educating themselves and being more aware, because this narrative is being pushed onto them. They no longer have the third option. They no longer have the acceptable third option of essentially just throwing their vote away. Yeah, I'll take your view on.
Presumably in these new democracies, there is a lot of momentum into this democracy. So why is it that you need this obligation to exist in order for people to vote?
Alright, I'll actually address that later. But first of all, not everyone in a essentially new democracy is really raring for change. We believe they're simply those who are either confused by the change or have no idea what to do in this new political landscape when they're actually given the choice. Thus, we believe we essentially need this spark so they can carefully essentially manage this and therefore have productive discussions about who will truly be the lesser of two evils. Okay, what is the effect of this narrative on the candidates? We believe this tells candidates that what they say or do matters, because they need to present themselves compared to their competitor as the lesser of two evils, because that is what people will be voting on. I'll take that later. This means that there is no guaranteed victory for them. They can't hope that everyone will just magically vote for them. They need to have measurable metrics for people to decide that they are essentially going to be the best for their country, because these people can't just not care and do whatever they want anymore. They are actually going to be an aware population that has to be catered to. I'll take your view.
Why do citizens abstain in your world and not vote for a third party?
Alright, as I've already sorry, could you repeat that, POI?
Why do citizens abstain and not vote for a third party?
Alright, so what we're saying, I'm not really saying that they like either abstain for or vote for a third party, but we believe no matter what they do, even if they do vote for the unviable third party, this is essentially throwing away their choice by directing the focus away from the actual two candidates who matter in this situation. Alright, so now that we have candidates who both care for achieving more change and citizens who are educated and know what better change looks like, what does this lead to when they are mixed together? First of all, we have a more aware population that politicians need to cater to. These politicians thus need to be better. They need to show themselves to be clearly better than their opponent. What does this result in? This leads to them keeping election promises, making election promises in the first place, making tangible benefits for the population that can easily be measured to prove that they are the lesser of two evils and better than the competitor. This thus has trickled-down impacts to other politics because citizens in general are going to be more aware, more involved in this process, and they do not have the acceptable option to essentially choose a third party and escape from the main clash of this conflict. Thus, principally, this also upholds people's right to make educated decisions and thus essentially support the candidate of their will, rather than essentially throwing this away and allowing whoever to take power, even if this may not be representative for them. What is the comparative? It tells people. The comparative is that we tell people that it doesn't really matter, you don't really have to get involved because you can just like vote for a third party, which won't really have any tangible impact anyways. And politicians are now catering to people who don't know what or don't care about the political landscape, which means that they can now resort to underhanded tactics which fundamentally undermine democracies, especially weak democracies. This leads me on to my second piece of extension, about how we need stability in essentially fading or new democracies. Alright, what do these democracies need? They need a strong voice. They need a strong citizen voice who can clearly distinguish which of the two candidates will actually be better for them. They don't need citizens who are constantly told, reinforced on a daily basis, that they can just run away from this decision, that they can simply vote for a third party when this third party has no realistic way to gain the same political momentum as the two main candidates and achieve the change that they want. Alright, so what are the harms of this? We believe when we tell people that it's okay to abstain from this election, this leads to a few main harms. First of all, let's step back for a moment and characterize these weak democracies. So we believe they may be not democracies that are swaying between two candidates, either, for example, an old dictator or like non-democratic ruler versus a new candidate who's popping up because of their new essentially democratic style, or failing democracies where one competitor significantly has given themselves more of an advantage. We believe essentially when people abstain from this vote, this gives these essentially undemocratic politicians room to fill up the citizen voice with propaganda. When citizens don't make their opinion clear, when they don't make it clear who they actually want out of these two candidates, this essentially gives developing countries, gives undemocratic rulers an option to step in and simply shape the citizen's voice for themselves by simply forcing propaganda onto people and forcing people to devote to this propaganda because they have no incentive to choose for themselves and inspect this for themselves. So we are the side which better offers stability to these weak democracies who need it most. Please vote CG. Thank you.
I thank the member of government for their speech and welcome the member of opposition to their closing opposition.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it's bad to force a gay person to choose between two homophobic presidents. That is why we win, right? Maybe in the short term, like Donald Trump doesn't get voted in. But in the long term, what closing opposition is able to prove is that one, we get worse democracy because you kill third parties, and two, you get less social progress. Note that OO misses several crucial mechanisms, which is why they are unable to access these benefits. Alright, before I go into my issues, a quick bit of weighing, because OO's biggest benefit, the only thing that keeps them standing in this debate, is just the fact that like, oh, you don't get someone who destroys the economy, you don't get someone who starts. Note that this benefit is contingent on the fact that the two major parties are hugely different. It's contingent on the fact that there is someone who's very, very bad and that there is someone who's slightly less bad. I think what we're able to prove through our characterization is that actually these two parties are going to be very, very similar, very marginally different. So actually what happens is that people suffer very similarly in both worlds. Right, I'm going to prove that right now. So OG's degree of benefit is contingent on how different those two major parties actually are. We're able to prove that they're actually very, very similar. Firstly, voters lie on a spectrum, mostly around the middle. Secondly, the incentive in a lesser of two evils political system is not to be a good party, but it is just to be slightly better than the other person. The reason why you have to only be slightly better than the other person is because it just means that you're able to capture a lot more of the voter base, especially when voters can only choose between two people. That means that being too radical means that it harms your image to the voters. It's very, very risky, and it means that the opposing side of the spectrum is more likely to swing towards the other political party. Alright, now onto my points about... Alright, go.
How do third parties emerge and become viable in
about
systems that are not preferential voting systems?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that. Alright. Why does this harm democracy? Because you're able to kill third parties. 3 reasons why. Firstly, it's because there is less incentive to join or start third parties to begin with, and that's just because you have a smaller voter base, and that's also because you're okay with the that's because there's two major parties that dominate. 2, there is less imperative or cultural imperative to start a third party to begin with, and that's just because when you live under a narrative that it is okay and acceptable to just have two parties that are kind of bad, but you vote for one that's less evil. When you have that, it means that you're less able to scrutinize what's bad about each aspect, right? Because your job as a voter is not to be like, I think this politician is the best. No, your job as a voter is to be like, I hate this one more, he's going to destroy the economy, I'm going to vote for the other one. And that is why you just have less incentive to criticize existing parts of the system. But finally, this narrative states that voters have an obligation to vote for the lesser evil, i.e. voting for smaller parties is just simply frowned upon. These third parties literally just never get off the ground. Why was this so bad? Alright. Firstly, it's just because a lot of these third parties literally are just made up of minorities who already get very little political representation. Obviously, that's horrible. But 2, because this kills democratic choice, and that's to say, the politician you vote for doesn't represent what you want. OG tells you that, representational choice is arbitrary, something like that. No. If you force a trans person to vote for a transphobic president because the other president is going to ruin the economy and leave them jobless, that's not choice, right? That is very clearly incredibly coercive, especially because they also say that you're not allowed to abstain, right? Now, a quick note on abstention. I think abstention is okay because every right has a reciprocal right not to be exercised. That is to say, the right to religion means that you're also allowed to opt out of religion, and therefore the right to vote also means that you're able to opt out of the right to vote. Alright, the impact of this is just to say that you fundamentally undermine the process of democracy, you fundamentally undermine people power, and that is why a government could literally never win this debate. But secondly, on why we are better for social progress. Alright, how does this narrative actually affect the two parties? 1, we think it means that there's less pressure to change, in that you don't actually have to be good. 2, it means that you're less likely to do things that are perceived to be radical, or less likely to do things that are closer to the other ends of the spectrum. And that's because it's a lot harder to run on a radical platform. It's a lot easier for the other person to attack you for those issues and demonize you. 3, you have less competitive threats from alternate third parties. You only have to compete with one person who you have to prove is just worse than you. 5, it means that parties never actually take a strong stance, right? And what that looks like is that parties are likely to have a very fluid, moderate stance. They're going to be very vague. They're going to dodge things. And the reason why is because the best political strategy is just always to be relative to your opponent. That means you have to be flexible. That means you have to be able to shift your stance. And that means that politicians actually never take a stance on issues that matter. Why is this bad? OO tells you that, oh, this is bad for minorities, but they never actually say why, which means that they're unable to actually buy that benefit. We give you the mechanisms. One, the impact of this is that society literally just doesn't improve ever. Like, there's no impetus to just be better. Two, it harms minorities because, one, minorities are the ones who benefit from the most radical left-wing stuff, right? That's stuff like minimum wage, that's stuff like active consent, access to abortion, right?
Pure.
No. Alright. The final impact of this is just to say that minorities just end up disengaging from the political system entirely. Alright, go.
You still failed to prove to me why third parties will emerge. How can your aforementioned trans person find a viable party that they will vote for apart from just wasting their vote?
Third parties exist. We're saying that in a narrative where you only have to, we literally gave you so many mechanisms why third parties are literally doomed to fail under your side of the house. That is the reason why they just never exist, right? We prefer a world in which where they exist versus a world in which where they literally just don't manifest to begin with. All right. Final reason why this is bad is just to say that minorities disengage from politics altogether, and what that means is that we're able to, if you believe their material about why abstention is bad, then we're able to flip that harm and you should buy our mechanism more. And that's particularly, you should weigh this the most in this debate because one, minorities are already underrepresented in politics, and two, they are the most vulnerable people who we all care about in this debate. At the end of the speech, what you should believe is that one, we are the side that's best able to provide democratic choice on principle. That is an absolute principle that we should be able to win on, but we're able to open up a separate win path for why we're able to get better social progress and why we're better for minorities. So proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition member for their speech and welcome up the government whip to close the government bench. Thank you.
If everyone is ready, I'll begin my speech on my first word. Panel, I'm going to do two main things for you on my speech today. First of all, I'm going to weigh our case extension from what we hear at opening government, and second of all, I'm going to move on to the two themes I've identified in this debate. First of which being which side of the House encourages better leadership, and second of all, which side of the House is better for developing democracies. So now moving on to weighing our case extension to what we hear from opening government. A critical mistake we hear from the opening government and also established by opening government and see later down the bench is that they characterize the world as a very privileged, well-developed democratic country. For example, the US, that is the example we hear right off the bat. We believe that we as closing government are the only team that takes the debate to consider developing democracies, developing countries who arguably are the ones who rely most heavily on establishing a strong democracy and having these voters. Okay. So what do we actually hear from opening government? We hear that first of all, there is going to be an effect of not voting on small parties, and second of all, people have the principal they have the right not to vote. They have the principal obligation to vote. So why do we believe it is less important to so heavily stress this debate on developed countries such as the US? First of all, we believe that the lesser of two evils philosophy, when you think hard enough about it, it's just democracy itself. Why is this the case? Never once before in history, in any country in the world, have we ever seen two perfect, viable political candidates, unless you're an extremely die-hard Trump supporter, for example, and have every aspect of your personality based on him. We believe that there is actually nobody who agrees entirely with their politician of choice. We believe nobody exactly is going to see anyone as a perfectly viable option or a perfect option. We simply believe that democracies have been stable and operating for so long in these countries, and that is the reason why we don't need to focus initially all of our points, which has been happening in this debate so far, on countries such as the US, such as Australia. So then, why is it on the other hand more important to consider developing countries in this debate? Three main reasons. First of all, they need stability in order to thrive, and that can only be done with strengthening a democratic government. Second of all, for newer democracies, the only way to do this is to have votes, and if we take away this narrative altogether, it is going to be harder to have votes, and therefore establish that democracy which is needed in order to have stability for these people. Third of all, larger democracies a lot of the time depend on developing democracies and vice versa. For example, for alliances and building relationships, that can only be done if a leader is voted in, and it is something which is going to benefit both parties. I'm going to establish this a little bit later, and we've also heard it from my first speaker. So I'm going to kind of move on to this more in my second theme, but before I do that, do I have any POIs? No? Okay, I am going to move on to my first theme, which is which side of the House encourages better leadership. What we hear from opposition bench is that we cannot communicate, that these people, these voters who are oppressed cannot communicate their desire for better politicians in the status quo when they're forced to choose between two parties which are problematic. And second of all, they believe that people have the right to do whatever they want. They have the right to abstain, they have the right to vote for a third party. Two main responses. First of all, the opposition makes the harmful assumption that voting for the lesser of two evil politicians is going to that they believe that voting for the lesser of two evils means that politicians are going to be even more terrible than usual, and people are going to be unable to do anything about this. Why is this not true? It is untrue for three main reasons. First of all, we believe that it is in the best interest of politicians to be good, or as good as they are able to be anyways, simply because they want to be voted in, and if they are the people in power, they want to continue to maintain that power. Second of all, we believe that politicians are at threat of losing votes in the status quo if they break their promise or are not good or better than their counterparts. We believe that a lot of politicians in the status quo are controversial and problematic. We believe that the harm which they have established is not actually a unique harm. No, thank you, not at the moment. In the status quo, if you are not good, someone else is going to be voted in. In their world, if you're not good, you're not going to get voted in at all. We believe that this is not a unique harm. We believe that it already exists in the status quo, which means that politicians do have the interest to be as good as they can. Third of all, there is mass speculation and criticism in the status quo. All you have to do is go onto Twitter to see that this is true. We believe that it is not going to encourage better leadership because we see that there is mass criticism, there is mass speculation, and it has not done anything in the status quo. Therefore, it is not a benefit which opposition can claim. Yes, I'll take your point.
If politicians were so bad under the status quo, why does this create a race to the top and not a race to the bottom?
Okay, so a race to the top is because if there is competition in the status quo, especially in countries where there is not such polarized sides, you have made the mistake of focusing on countries such as the US, which have been very much polarized. And I believe that because this competition exists, there is that inherent sense that you have to be better than the other politician. And if one politician makes a move, then another one is going to make a move as well. That is essentially what politics is. It's a game to be better than your competitors, so therefore it is a race to the top. Okay, now moving on to my second response, which is that solving leadership does not come from abstaining from votes. Abstaining from votes does not change politicians as effectively as opposition imagines that they will. Why is this the case? From the examples we have heard up to now in this debate, for example, the US and Australia, which are extremely polarized, abstaining from votes does not do anything which really affects electoral outcomes because the people who want to vote for their politicians are going to continue to do so. And even if we take them at their best case and assume that it does somehow affect these elections, we believe that all it is going to happen is that democracies are going to suffer, or they are going to become weaker because it is going to be slower and less easy to function. We believe that elections are going to go for longer and it's going to be more tedious, which overall just harms democracies anyways. Okay, now moving on to my final theme of which side of the House is better for developing democracies. We believe that this has been largely unresponded to by the entire opposition bench. Our points at this point of the debate still stand. I'm going to right now re-step through why they are important to this debate. So first of all, why do we care about unstable democracies more than countries such as the US or Australia? First of all, because we believe that there are more vulnerable people in these developing democracies simply because of less stability, which means that the net harm to the rights of the citizens is greater. Second of all, they're more unstable, which leads to more conflict or civil conflict. Third of all, there is going to be a ripple effect to global stability, which I'm going to move on to now. So stability, we believe that although voting for the lesser of two evils may not be the most ideal situation, or you might not be the most ideal person in power, it is better than a counterfactual, which is having no leader and no stability. So what is actually happening in developing democracies realistically? They're going to hold an election. People either don't want to vote or don't know how to vote, or they're just simply going to abstain. And we believe that this is going to be exacerbated if there is not the narrative anymore of voting for the lesser of two evils. This is bad because when there is no stability, you're going to have no result. You're going to hold an election again. There is going to be no result. You're going to hold an election again. This is going to drag on. And with no stability, people are going to continue to live in poverty. The risk of conflict is going to increase. And simply because these are the most vulnerable people, this is what we should be caring about the most at this point in this debate. So because we prove that this is better for developing democracies who are able to form alliances, who are able to have more stability, and also because it encourages better leadership, very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the government whip for their speech and welcome the opposition whip to conclude the opposition bench and the debate. Cheers here.
This narrative encouraged complacency. That meant that political parties did not progress because people were coerced into being satisfied with a subpar status quo. This was going to be incredibly bad for democracy and for political policies, and for that reason, we win today's debate. 3 questions I'm going to be asking. Firstly, why an extension was most valuable in this debate. Secondly, why we'd be closing extension, and then finally, why we'd be opening. Okay, firstly, why the value of our extension was the most important thing in this debate. We give you 2 extensions. The first is to say that the quality of choice in a democracy improves. I think this was incredibly important in this debate for 3 main reasons. Firstly, I think the principle of democracy and the fact that people now have more choice thanks to things like third parties just flips many of the government's claims. That's to say that it proves the principle of a better democracy, and I think that's just so much stronger than the kind of individual obligations that government tries to tell you about how, say, people have an obligation not to be complicit in like the winning of a bad victor, right? I think those were obviously very individual obligations that I think were also weaker because, as Melissa tells you, obviously the inverse of those principles apply. But I think, no thanks. The second thing to say is I think we flipped the quite already flimsy trust argument, which is just the idea that people are obviously going to have less trust in democracy when there are, going to be less choices and they're going to have less faith in it. But I think the final thing to say is we offer a vertical extension to opening's unrecognized argument, and that is just to give you several reasons why the strength of democracy is so much better on our side, including the fact that people have so much less choice due to this narrative, the fact that people have worse representation, and finally because people have poor accountability. Because of this, they are likely to have a kind of status quo bias where they're, say, happy with the Labour Party or happy with Joe Biden. They're unlikely to hold them accountable. This was really bad. The next way in which we advance in this debate is by proving to you that this was going to have good progress for minorities. 3 reasons why this was really good. Firstly, I think this just really helped the most vulnerable people, right? That look like things like people of colour not having to settle for bad migration policies. It looks like Melissa told you, gay people not being pressured to vote for less outwardly homophobic candidates, right? I think these were obviously really big benefits to very vulnerable groups. But I think the second thing is, obviously, these people have been historically wronged, therefore I think our impact is much greater. But I think the final thing to say is that currently minorities constitute a greater proportion of the population than they do of government. That is just to say that government was not democratic insofar as it was not representative, because minorities often did not get a voice or an opportunity to be represented in parliament. Okay, the final thing I'm going to do before I accept a point of information is just to defend this argument that we give you about third parties, which OG seems to have a problem with. OG tries to suggest in their point of information that third parties are going to exist. 3 reasons why I would reject that. The first is to say that I think right now they do, and that is with the absence of this narrative, right? This narrative only makes it harder for third parties, as we tell you, and even in a world with this narrative, parties like the Greens, parties like independent parties in the USA still exist. Very unclear why they wouldn't on our side. In fact, I think they would exist to a greater extent. But I think secondly, the demand exists for third parties in the absence of this narrative. That is to say that people are no longer satisfied by moderates. People are looking for policies that represent them. People are very willing to vote for third parties. Therefore, they are likely to emerge, and people are actually likely to join third parties. No, thank you. The final thing to say is that worst case, say these third parties never make politics. I think we gave you reasons why it is likely that they will make it in, say, 100 years. That was still a benefit because at least we got progress. But even if you didn't believe that, maybe they got more seats, maybe they got more legitimacy, maybe they could do things like form coalitions. That was ultimately better than a claim that no one else in this debate could claim. Before I move on to why we'd be closing, I'll take a POI.
You talk about stagnancy of policy. We bring you 3 reasons at opening why there is change. Change from within parties, social media and polls. How do third parties failing at the ballot box improve this?
I'm just going to be dealing with your arguments when I move to opening. I'm going to firstly deal with closing extensions and then I'll work with you. Okay, firstly on closing extensions, 3 main extensions. Okay, first they try and tell you this was going to be better because now citizens are going to be more educated. 3 responses. Firstly, this was contingent on people abstaining and not just voting for a third party. I think, like, if you vote for a third party, you probably get political awareness out of that. You're probably also likely to do that because I think people probably are more likely to actually, like, if they want to have some kind of input in the democratic system, they're more likely to do this and abstain. Secondly, I think it's not a unique benefit. That is to say that this narrative is incredibly coercive. There were other ways to get people to be educated, like turning on the news or like teaching people in schools, right? Like this was a really weird claim for them to have. But I think the final thing to say is I think the inverse is actually more likely. That is to say, I think people probably become a lot less interested in politics and the intricacies of political ideology when literally you have a two-party system where most of the things they say sound the same. You're probably not as invested in politics. The next claim then is this is really good for emerging democracies. 3 responses. Firstly, I think we weigh this out by virtue of just the scale. That is to say that there are more established democracies than there are emerging ones. We probably just prefer the democracies that exist numerically larger. Secondly, I think the two-party system exists because parties often have some kind of historical advantage. That is to say that if it's a completely blank new political system, it's unclear why you have 2 major predominant parties. You probably have quite a few. Therefore, I don't think this narrative even applies in these cases. But I think finally, if anything, we flip this because I think we explained to you why this was going to be bad for the health of democracy, and that was particularly good for countries where minorities needed to have that third option rather than just settling for really bad governments. Okay. Final claim that they try and say is now people need to be good in office and stick to their promises. It just seems symmetric because obviously you can be voted out on both sides. I think this was a little bit unclear, but I think actually we can flip this because I think all you needed to do to be considered a good politician in parliament is you just needed to fearmonger people. Like Joe Biden just needed to be like, yes, maybe I'm not super anti-racist, but Trump's more racist, right? I think it was actually way more easy for you to escape this kind of accountability. No, thank you. Okay, very, very quickly, finally, on why I think we'd be opening. So I think opening is trying to push the kind of principle. I think we've quite clearly mitigated this by just telling you that obviously the inverse principle applies. I think then the next claim is to tell you that less bad policies are better than bad policies. 2 responses. I think firstly, maybe this was true in the short term, but I think the progress comes incredibly slow or not at all on their side. That was obviously horrible. But I think secondly, parties are actually quite hyper aware of their voting grounds. So I think if they know that a third party are more competitive, they're likely to try and pander to more voters. I think as opposed to the fact that they can just on their side rely on the narrative and rely on just maintaining being the lesser of 2 evils. I think the next thing that they try and tell you was that there were other democratic avenues for people to pursue. I think that this argument is one that is neglected by opening opposition, but I'm going to explain why I think this is untrue. 2 reasons. Firstly, I think voting translates to the patterns of other behaviours. That is to say that usually you will do things like vote in polls, like you vote in elections. If you support the Labour Party because of this coercive norm, you are probably also likely to do things like political campaigning for them. But I think the second thing to say was, you basically had no power over this if governments could ignore things like polls or ignore things like lobbying because they knew that when election cycle came around, they could just rely on the fact that they were better than the other party. That is why we won today's debate.